divorce papers were already signed before Mirelle even sat down. That was the part that stayed with her afterward, not the words Julian used, not the way his mother stood near the fireplace with her hands folded like she was watching something she'd been waiting years to see. It was the papers, already signed, already dated. Which meant he had made this decision before he called her into the room, before he asked her to sit, before he said her name in that careful, distant way that told her he'd rehearsed it. Mirelle Ashton Carr, 37 years old, Senior Acquisitions Director at a firm called Northgate Capital, wife of Julian Carr for 9 years, stood in the doorway of her own living room and understood in the space of one breath that the man she had loved since she was 28 had made his choice without her. The other woman's name was Cassandra. She was sitting on the small settee near the window, the one Mirelle had picked out at a furniture shop on Queen Street West, the year she and Julian moved into the house. Cassandra was 31, a marketing consultant who had met Julian at a conference in Calgary 14 months ago. And she was wearing a silk blouse the color of winter cream. And she was not looking at Mirelle. She was looking at the floor with an expression that someone had coached her into believing looked like remorse. Julian's mother, Elspeth Carey, 67, was the one who spoke first. "We thought it was better this way," Elspeth said. Clean, no prolonged conversations. Mirelle looked at the papers on the coffee table. Then she looked at Julian. Julian was 41, handsome in the way that men who have always been told they are handsome become. Slightly unaware of it, slightly reliant on it. He was wearing the grey suit he kept for serious occasions. She had bought him that suit. She had taken it to the tailor on Bloor Street herself when the jacket needed altering. "I think," Mirelle said, and her voice was very steady, which surprised her, "that you should all go ahead with whatever you've planned for this evening. I have work to finish." She picked up the folder she'd set down in the doorway. She turned around, she walked up the stairs. She did not cry until she was in the upstairs bathroom with the door locked and the tap running, and even then it was only for a few minutes. She had never been someone who cried for long. It was one of the things Elspeth had always said about her, not as a compliment. What none of them knew, not Julian, not Elspeth, not Cassandra in her wintercream blouse, was what was inside that folder. Mirelle had carried it into the house from the car. She had been holding it when she walked through the front door and heard voices in the living room and understood, before she even pushed the door open, that something had shifted. She'd set it down when she saw the papers. She'd picked it back up when she left. The folder contained the final term sheet for a transaction that Northgate Capital had been structuring for 11 months. A full acquisition, a complete buyout of a mid-sized regional development company whose debt load had become unmanageable and whose founding family was desperate enough to accept terms they would not have considered 2 years earlier. The company was called Carey & Sons Development. It had been founded by Julian's grandfather. It had been built into something substantial by Julian's father, who died when Julian was 32. It had been slowly, quietly, irreversibly mismanaged by Julian and his brother Derek ever since. Mirelle had known about the debt for 4 years. She had discovered it by accident, a statement left open on the kitchen counter during a weekend when Julian was distracted and careless. She had not said anything. She had watched. She had gone back to work on Monday and begun, very quietly, to understand exactly how bad it was. It was bad. It was worse than bad. By the time Northgate's analysts had finished their review, Carey & Sons was 18 months from insolvency. Mirelle had structured the acquisition herself. She had recused herself from the final approval committee, citing a conflict of interest she described in writing as a personal connection to one of the company's principals. The committee had approved the deal without her. The offer had gone out 3 weeks ago through proper channels, addressed to Derek, who was technically the company's president. Julian had not told her. She had not told Julian. She stood at the bathroom mirror and looked at herself for a long time after the tears stopped. She had married this man. She had believed in this man. She had driven him to the hospital at 2 in the morning when his father had the first stroke. And she had sat in the waiting room for 6 hours. And she had been the one to tell him when the doctor came out with that expression that tells you everything before the words do. She had held his hand in the car on the way home. She had gone into work 3 hours late and told no one why. And he had signed divorce papers before she sat down. She dried her face. She opened the folder. She read through the term sheet one more time, not because she needed to. She had written most of it, but because it steadied her. Numbers steadied her. Structures steadied her. Clean transactions with defined outcomes steadied her in ways that people lately did not. She closed the folder. She set it on the counter beside the sink. Then she picked up her phone and sent a message to the managing partner at Northgate. "Everything is proceeding as expected," she wrote. "I'll be in early tomorrow." The thing about Julian Carre was that he had always believed his family name was a kind of protection, not arrogance exactly. He wasn't a cruel man, he wasn't even a dishonest one, not in the ordinary way. He loved his mother, and he loved his brother, and he had for many years loved Mirelle, though he had stopped being able to articulate what that meant, somewhere around the 5th or 6th year of their marriage, when things between them had grown comfortable in the way that things do when two people have stopped asking difficult questions. Elspeth had never liked Mirelle. This was not a secret. Elspeth had made her feelings known in the subtle, consistent, deniable way that certain women have perfected over decades. A comment here, a preference there, a habit of describing Mirelle's professional accomplishments with a particular inflection that made them sound like character flaws. Too ambitious, too focused. Doesn't she ever just want to be home? Mirelle worked long hours. This was true. She traveled for deals, sometimes for weeks at a time. This was also true. What was not true, what had never been true, was Elspeth's steady implication that Mirelle's work was the reason the marriage had grown distant. The distance had been there long before the long hours. Mirelle understood this. She was not certain Julian ever had. Cassandra had come along at the right moment, which was to say the worst moment. Julian had been anxious about the company. He was always anxious about the company, had been for years, and it was the one subject he refused to discuss with Mirelle in any honest way. He would say things were difficult and change the subject. He would say Derek was handling it, and pour himself another drink. He would not say, "We are losing ground every quarter, and I don't know how to stop it, and I am terrified of what happens when my father's name is no longer enough to keep the doors open." Cassandra had listened to all of this. That was what Mirelle eventually understood. Not that Cassandra was brilliant or calculating. She didn't think she was, particularly, but that she had been willing to sit with Julian in his fear in a way that Mirelle, after years of watching him refuse to be honest about it, had stopped doing. She had stopped being patient with a problem he wouldn't name. She had not stopped caring, but she had stopped performing the patience, and Julian had interpreted the absence as distance, and Elspeth had provided the interpretation that suited her best. So here they were. Mirelle came downstairs at 8 o'clock. The house was quiet. Julian and Elspeth and Cassandra had gone. She heard a car in the driveway around 6:30 voices, a door. She had stayed upstairs. She had eaten crackers from the bag she kept in her work bag and answered 7 emails and called her sister in Vancouver, not to tell her anything, just to hear a familiar voice talking about ordinary things. She made tea. She stood at the kitchen window looking out at the back garden, which was early spring and unlovely, the ground still half frozen, the perennials not yet showing. She had planted most of those perennials herself. She wondered briefly who would tend them. Her phone buzzed. It was a message from Derek Carre, Julian's brother, 44, co-director of Carre & Sons. "Just got off the phone with our lawyers," he wrote. "Have you seen the acquisition offer from Northgate?" She looked at the message for a moment. Then she set the phone face down on the counter and finished her tea. The meeting was scheduled for 10 days later. Carre & Sons had retained counsel, conducted their own valuation, and come back with a counter that Northgate's team had reviewed and found acceptable within the expected range. The final negotiation session was set for the 16th floor of a building on Bay Street, in one of those glass and grey boardrooms that look the same in every city. A long table, water pitchers, a view of the city that is impressive enough to remind you where you are. Mirelle arrived first. She always arrived first. It was a habit she'd developed early in her career and never abandoned. The simple advantage of being in the room before anyone else, of knowing the space before the conversation started. She was setting up at the head of the table when the Carre & Sons delegation arrived. There were 4 of them. Their external counsel, a woman named Faris, who Mirelle had encountered twice before in other transactions. Their CFO, a man named Gilroy, who had come on board 2 years ago and had the specific look of someone who has spent 2 years understanding how bad things are. Derek, who was wearing the expression of a man who has convinced himself that he is being treated unfairly by a situation of his own making. And Julian, who had not known, who could not have known, because Mirelle had been meticulous about that, had recused herself precisely so that no one at Northgate could tell him, had structured the conflict disclosure so that it named her connection to a principal without naming which principal. Julian walked into the boardroom and stopped. The color went out of his face in a way that Mirelle had never seen before, not slowly. All at once, like something switched off. "Mirelle Julian," she said. Her voice was the same voice she'd used in the living room 10 days ago, steady, unhurried. Faris, the lawyer, looked between them with the alert stillness of someone recalculating rapidly. Gilroy, the CFO, had the expression of a man who has just understood something that has been confusing him for months. Derek's face had gone a particular shade of red. You're with Northgate, Julian said. It wasn't quite a question. I'm the Senior Acquisitions Director at Northgate, Morel said. I've been with the firm for 6 years. I recused myself from the approval committee and disclosed my connection to the vendor at the outset. The transaction was approved independently. She paused. Shall we sit down? Faris said. Perhaps we could have a moment? Of course, Morel said. Take all the time you need. I'll be just outside. She took her coffee and walked out to the corridor and stood at the window looking down at Bay Street. It was a clear day, cold for April, the kind cold that Torontonians know means winter hasn't entirely decided to leave yet. She watched a streetcar move slowly through the intersection below. She thought about the perennials in the back garden. She thought about the grey suit hanging in the closet of what was no longer quite her house. She thought about a morning 7 years ago when Julian had been passed over for a contract he'd wanted badly, and she had made coffee and sat with him at the kitchen table and not said anything for a long time, just sat there. And eventually he had said, I don't know what I'd do without you, and she had believed him. The door opened behind her. It was Derek. You knew, he said. His voice was tight. You knew about all of this, and you didn't say anything. I disclosed my connection, Morel said. Appropriately and in writing. That's not what I mean, and you know it. She turned to look at him. Derek Carey was a man who had inherited a great deal and earned very little of it, and had spent 20 years being furious at anyone who noticed. She had always understood him. She had never particularly liked him. I found out about the debt 4 years ago, she said. I told Julian then. I told him it was serious. He told me he and you had it under control. She paused. You did not have it under control. You could have, Derek started. I could have what? Her voice didn't change. Managed it for you? Told you things you could have found out yourselves if you'd been paying attention? Watched the company your grandfather built continue to decline while your brother used it as a reason to spend time with someone else? She looked at him steadily. I did what I could, Derek. I structured an acquisition that will retire the debt, protect your employees, and preserve the Carrier name on the buildings. That's more than the company would have gotten from anyone else. Derek opened his mouth. Then he closed it. Julian wants to speak with you, he said finally. I know, Morel said. Send him out. Julian looked older than he had 10 days ago. This was probably not literally true, but that was the impression. Something in him that had been upright had become slightly less so. He stood in the corridor beside her, and for a long moment neither of them said anything. A paralegal from another firm walked past with a stack of folders. An elevator opened and closed. How long, he said. 11 months on the transaction, Morel said. 4 years knowing it was coming. He absorbed this. Why didn't you tell me? His voice was careful. That it was Northgate, that you were involved. I recused myself as soon as the target was identified. That was the right procedure. That's not what I'm asking. She looked at him. No, she said, it isn't. She turned back to the window. I didn't tell you because you had already told me, in 9 years of not being able to talk about it honestly, that you didn't want my help. You wanted me to pretend it wasn't happening. I stopped pretending. She paused. You found someone else to pretend for you. Julian was quiet. I loved you, he said. It came out raw, like it surprised him. I know, Morel said. I loved you too. Past tense, both of them. Standing in a corridor on Bay Street with a view of a city going about its business below. The deal is fair, she said. Your lawyers know it. Faris knows it. The terms protect what can be protected. Sign it, Julian. Do something right by your grandfather's company before it's too late to do anything at all. She picked up her coffee cup. She went back to the door. Morel. His voice was quiet. She turned. By what right, he said, and then stopped. He didn't finish it. He couldn't, probably. He was asking the question he should have asked 10 days ago, when he handed her papers she hadn't asked for in a room that had her name on the mortgage. She looked at him for a moment. Northgate Capital acquired 63% of Carr & Sons' outstanding debt through 3 separate instruments over the past 18 months, she said. The acquisition gives us controlling interest in the restructured entity. She held his gaze. By what right am I here, Julian? I own the table you're sitting at. She went back into the boardroom. She set her coffee down. She looked at the Carr & Sons team and at Faris and at Gilroy, whose expression had settled into something that looked almost like professional respect. Ready? She said. Nobody argued. The deal closed on a Thursday in May, 6 weeks later. Morel was in the office when the confirmation came through, a notification on her screen, a brief message from the closing team, then the particular quiet that follows the end of something that has taken a long time. Her assistant brought her coffee she hadn't asked for. She appreciated the gesture. She had signed the lease on a new apartment in the annex 3 weeks ago. It had good light in the mornings and a small balcony where she'd decided she was going to try growing something. She didn't know what yet, maybe herbs, Maybe something that didn't require as much patience as perennials. Her sister had flown in from Vancouver for a weekend, and they had carried boxes and drunk wine on the bare floor, and her sister had said, "You seem okay," and Morel had said, "I am," and meant it more than she expected to. She had not spoken to Julian since the corridor on Bay Street. She had received one message from Elspeth, a single line, no greeting, no signature, that said, "I hope you're satisfied." Morel had read it twice, set her phone down and gone back to work. She did not reply. There was nothing in that message that required one. The thing Morel kept returning to, in the weeks after, not obsessively, not with bitterness, but in the way you return to something you're still making sense of, was how long she had known and what she had done with knowing. She had not set out to acquire the company. That was important to her, and it was true. The deal had come to Northgate through ordinary channels. She had disclosed the conflict exactly when she should have. She had stepped back exactly as she was supposed to. She had not at any point used her position to harm Julian, or to benefit herself beyond what the transaction warranted. What she had done was go to work. What she had done was be very good at her job for 6 years. What she had done was sit in rooms like that boardroom on Bay Street, and know what she was doing and do it carefully and well. Day after day, long before anyone in the Carre family had stopped to wonder what she did all day. That was the part she thought about. Not the corridor, not the look on Julian's face when he walked into the room, not the line about the table, which she had not planned but which had come out of her with a precision that surprised her. The kind of thing you say when you are tired of pretending to be less than what you are. Just the years of work, the years of showing up, the years of being, quietly and without ceremony, the person in the room who knew what was in the folder. She turned off her monitor. She pulled on her coat. She took the elevator down and walked out into the May evening, which was warm. Now, finally, the city having made up its mind about the season, and she walked north toward the subway and thought about what she would plant on the balcony. Something that came back every year without being asked. Something that didn't need much to keep going. She thought she would start there.